This is the second workshop from phase 2. We had our last one on March 3rd. Next, please. Today, we ask you to please use the raise hand feature if you would like to speak and wait for the facilitator to give you the floor. Share your name and video if you're able. Use the chat for additional questions and comment. Please mute yourself when not speaking. Everyone has the ability to unmute themselves, so hopefully you keep yourself muted during the presentation, but feel free to unmute yourself during questions and answer. Next, please. So today I'll be giving a very quick and brief recap of our last workshop and overview of CAP Blueprint. And then I'll pass it over to ERG, who will run through CAP Phase 2 analysis overview. And then we'll have a few sections for Q&A and clarification questions. And then we're going to open up, instead of going to breakout groups, this time we're just going to actually open it up to discussion to the entire group with a set of questions. And then we have next steps and closing, and like typically, we leave the line open in case there are other clarification questions or comments. Next, please. So you'll see our project team members. There's Charles Goodhue, who's the project manager and economist for ERG. John Carter, who's the technical lead, Hannah Stroud, who's the deputy project manager. And then if you've been a part of any of these in the past and last year, you recognize Vandu and Julie Curdy, who are from MAPC, and they're leading the community engagement piece. So they've been with us from the beginning. The team can wave their hands. Great. So really quickly, we are now here on February-June final CAP phase. As I mentioned, at the last meeting, we went through the Climate Action Plan Blueprint. We also went through some concepts on building climate resilience. We went through the definitions of mitigation and adaptation, and what does resilience mean for this phase. We also defined environmental justice, and what does that mean for our process now. So I really encourage you, if you put next actually, I really encourage you to watch the recording of the last workshop if you missed it, to get an overview of those terms and that process. And I also included a link to the CAP newsletter, and I'll also paste a link to it on the chat. If you aren't already registered for updates, we include a monthly update on there of all upcoming events and ways to participate in the process and stay engaged. So that's a little screenshot of the updates page. Next, please. So as a reminder of why we're here today, this is we're going to be discussing what is we're going to be going through strategies to reach net zero by 2030 in line with the Climate Emergency Declaration, which was passed in 2020, which calls for net zero as quickly as possible with a target date of 2030. So what is net zero? Net zero is reducing the community's greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible and removing or offsetting any remaining emissions by the target date of 2030. So here you can see the breakdown of emissions in the community, and then 10.2 metric tons of CO2 is the estimate of how much each resident in Acton emits. And next, I'll pass it on to Hannah from ERG.
Thanks, Andrea. Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah. I'm so glad you all could come today. So thanks for being a part of this process. I was just going to give you a quick overview of what phase 2 looks like. So what ERG is working on for Acton. We broke up phase 2 into 5 kind of subtasks or steps. Right now, we're wrapping up task 1.1, which is the grouping and prioritization of strategies from the blueprint. We're about to launch into task 1.2 and 1.3, which are the greenhouse gas emission reductions analysis and the cost benefit analysis. And we'll be diving more into that today about what our methods will look like and what some of those outputs that you might see from phase 2 will look like. And then at the end of the spring, we're going to wrap that up. So we'll develop recommendations for implementing these strategies and get some draft figures, graphics, and text that will be implemented into the Acton's climate action plan. So next slide, please. So we started off on March 2nd with our community kickoff, where we provided a more detailed project plan overview than I just gave. And then we broke out into discussion rooms and really talked about that prioritization criteria, and then a little bit of how we could define net zero and talked about carbon offsets. So next slide, please. Just to recap what we talked about and what we heard. So we really focused on the criteria we were going to use to prioritize those group strategies. And the criteria are these 8 that are listed on the screen. What we heard from most of you were the most important things to consider were the capacity to reduce greenhouse gases. Also pretty interested on what that return on investment will be and if it's cost effective. All of these other criteria were important. I think we got a lot of good comments about social equity and environmental justice, biodiversity, and resilience as well. And while the original goal when we started was to use this criteria to prioritize which strategies we would analyze, we have since grouped those strategies and found out that we only have about 20 and that we were planning on analyzing about 15. And so what ended up really helping us choose were the kind of data availability and then the feasibility of analysis. So the criteria that we discussed last time is still really important, and we're still prioritizing the strategies, and that will help us develop those implementation and recommendations in our tasks 2 and 3. So I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, John Carter, now to talk a little bit more about what we've done since we last met and where we're going.
Thank you, Hannah. Hi, everyone. I'm John Carter. I'm an engineer with Eastern Research Group, or ERG. So as Hannah mentioned, we took your input at the last meeting about what is important to stakeholders, residents in Acton with regard to these strategies for reducing greenhouse gases. And we're moving into the next phase of a more quantitative analysis on these things. Using all the hard work that you all did with the town over the past couple of years on the blueprint document, that blueprint document contained a little over 60 actions that really kind of provided a lot of detail about what the town is willing and able and interested in doing to achieve the goal of net zero emissions by 2030. Using kind of for the purposes of our quantitative analysis, and due to the overlapping nature of a lot of those specific actions, what we're doing is we're actually rolling up or aggregating those actions into the 20 or so groups that were presented in the blueprint document. And we're showing a couple of those. We're calling them strategies now, and they're basically collections of those actions as they were presented in the blueprint document. So the strategy level is how we're going to be analyzing the effectiveness and the benefits and costs of these strategies going forward. We're not losing any of the detail of those actions. In fact, in some cases, we will actually be analyzing them at the action level where appropriate. If the costs and benefits for certain actions are different than they would be at the strategy level, we'll break them back out. But by and large, we're going to be looking at things at the strategy level now. And this is presented on the screen here. It's just an example of kind of the first 3 strategies and how the actions from the blueprint document kind of map to that strategy. Again, there's nothing different here than was presented in the blueprint document. We're just kind of re-aggregating things for the purpose of our analysis moving forward. Next slide, please. Here's one example. Strategy 2 is aligning Acton's zoning and planning with clean energy and sustainability standards. So this is primarily in regard to new buildings or future buildings that may be constructed over the next 8, 10, 20 years in Acton. And the effect of this strategy is, and the increased zoning or sustainability standards that might be applied to those new buildings is really what we're going to be measuring in terms of their greenhouse gas reduction potential. So again, as pertaining to new construction or major retrofits that happen in the future. There will be other strategies that focus on the existing building stock. And this is just an example of how we're going to analyze this one particular strategy, which includes a couple of different actions from the blueprint document. On the benefit cost side, I'm going to invite our senior economist, Charles, here to say a few words about those bullets.
Great, thanks, John. So this one is one that we think in terms of the outputs that could be helpful. We were going to look at the benefit and cost at sort of that unit level or the house level, potentially, or the range of costs that might come in for a new type of construction. And often we were also going to think about this in terms of that benefit per ton of CO2 reduced. So those are two outputs, and I'll go into those outputs a little bit more in a future slide. But how would we tackle this one? Well, we need to think about our baseline, and our baseline's sort of without this strategy, what might continue to happen. Maybe there's houses that have natural gas, propane, oil, whatever the mix of kind of status quo options are, that might be a baseline we want to compare to. And then we might want to sort of think about that fossil fuel free infrastructure, so a fully electrified house, as something we might make an assumption for in this strategy, and look at that incremental, potentially incremental cost, that change in cost, as well as the cost to operate each over some time frame. What benefits in costs do we look at? Again, we look at those financial costs and benefits, that incremental change in that initial construction cost, and that change in operation cost of purchasing, maintaining both the electrification scenario, that strategy, as well as that natural gas, propane, oil, or sort of other heating scenario. But we also look at other benefits. Many of you may have heard the term, what they sort of call social cost of carbon. And really that's what are the impacts that increased emissions of greenhouse gases might have. And that might be sort of the benefit could be reduced heating or reduced flooding if we lower our emissions. Another major impact could be, for example, if we're not burning propane or oil, there'll be cleaner air in terms of particulate matter, nitrous oxides and sulfur dioxide, and those are known to cause asthma, some cancer, and other breathing impacts. So that reduced impact in terms of that health benefit is something else we'll look at. So I'll pause there, John, and turn it back over to you to keep going.
Thank you, Charles. You can go to the next slide, please. Just to show another example on the energy front, we kind of outlined strategies 5 and 6 here. Both are fairly similar, talking about providing access to carbon-free electricity through a couple of different mechanisms. E1 or strategy 5 incorporates the action E1 from the blueprint document. And as you can see there, it's through the Acton Power Choice program. So our baseline there would be a continuation of current participation in that program. But through our analysis, looking out through 2030, we're going to be looking at incremental changes to that baseline and what additional participation and benefit could be achieved through that program. Similarly, in strategy 6 there, that's it's related because it's still talking about access to carbon-free electricity. So in terms of the greenhouse gas reduction approach, these two strategies are going to have the same or very similar net effect, and very much overlapping in that the future greenhouse gas footprint of electricity in Acton will hopefully be 100% carbon free. On the economic side, however, there may be very different economic analyses associated with each of these strategies. And in this case, this is an example of where the economic approach might be split out separately between each strategy because of the variation between the two and the cost related to implementing each one. So let's go to the next slide, please. And we will pause in a couple slides here just to see if you have any clarifying questions. We also have what we're calling supporting strategies. As I mentioned, there were about 20 overarching strategies once we aggregated all of those actions from the blueprint document. A handful of them don't really have a greenhouse gas reduction potential per se, nor do they necessarily have an economic component either. What you're seeing here on this slide is just two examples of what we're calling supporting strategies. In this case, they are advocacy for policy change, and they are in support of other strategies. The ones there that I mentioned, strategies 1 and 2, which pertain to building efficiency improvements, and strategies 5 and 6, which pertain to the 100% clean energy. So there will be some of these supporting strategies that we do not analyze in detail because they are there to support other strategies that will have a more quantifiable impact. So just wanted to point that out and like I said, there's only a handful of the 20. So I think we'll be looking at least 15 in detail as we move forward. So I wanted to pause there. You can go to the next slide. Just to see if there was any clarifying questions from the audience about how or why we are grouping these and aggregating them back to a bit of a higher level before we move on into a discussion of our methodology.
Yeah, actually, John, before we do that, I'm just going to answer a few of the other questions that have been popping up in the chat. So just looking up right now. So Kim Castens asked, about the privatization process, the subset of Acton residents who come to climate action plan events are a very skewed subset of Acton residents, skewed by level of concern for climate crisis if nothing else. How will your process ensure that the values and priorities of the non-CAP event attendees are taken into account? And this is just to, I think this is a really good question, and it's a really big one, right? Because making sure folks know about this and getting engagement from folks who want to participate but might not know about this involved is really important. A lot of these, I mean, every single one of these actions came from the blueprint. So in that sense, that does come from feedback that we've already received. So, since between June and September, we received 386 responses through our community-wide survey. We led 13 different events, including focus group discussions with various stakeholder groups. We tried to vary those discussions with like a walk at Narra Park, for example, and then also, through the open house at Narra. And then these focus group discussions were a little bit more intimate in a way of getting folks to, for example, we had a renter focus group discussion so that we could focus on specific actions that might impact those populations. We also worked with the Acton Boxborough High School students, the resource force group, to try to get involvement from students and youth, and et cetera, including interviews to various stakeholders and businesses. So more recently, we yesterday presented with the Acton Climate and Housing Justice Group, and then we also gave a presentation to the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Commission. So there's certainly always room for more engagement. So I think it's good to bring it up. We will have an opportunity to provide feedback over email on some of this, and we'll be following up through the Climate Action Plan blog on those next steps. And if you are not signed up, I encourage you to sign up, and I'll include the link before we sign off today. And then let's see. Alyssa asked, does the baseline for new construction include the loss of carbon fixing ability of the land that is clear cut and or loss of embodied carbon when old buildings are demolished? So I'll throw that over to John or Charles.
I'll take a shot at that. I think one of our next steps, as we'll discuss, I think on the very next slide, is developing a forecast of future emissions for Acton. And that's going to be based on one or more growth factors, which we haven't really discussed as a project team yet. We'll be working with the town and Andrea to really look at growth factors that are available through probably the local planning organization, either in terms of population or housing units or employment or some demographic factor like that has been projected out to see what the growth looks like over time, and especially through 2030. If it's significant, if that forecast is significant, then this question could have some merit. If it's relatively flat, then maybe not so much. If there's not a lot of forecast growth, I wouldn't see a lot of impact from reduced carbon fixing on developed land, but that's kind of yet to be seen.
Great, thank you, John. And I'm going to read one more from the chat and then go to people who are raising their hand and then go back to the chat just to mix it up a little bit. But the next one is in the buildings analysis from Kim. In the buildings analysis, how would you envision incentivizing smaller houses in addition to fully electrified houses? So this actually goes back to the blueprint, which mentions adopting zoning changes to allow for broader and more multifamily housing choices and flexible approaches to achieve housing affordability and accessibility. So this actually pulls and reiterates the sustainable elements of the housing production plan. And we kind of add a few other points on there. For example, ensure zoning aligns with land conservation goals by working closely with Natural Resources Department and stakeholders in developing these changes, and exploring ways to use zoning to encourage housing development to be as sustainable as possible. So that's another one from the chat. Deborah, I see your hand raised, so maybe we can mix it up by having you speak.
Thank you, Andrea. Two quick things. One is a global thing that I said last time I'm going to keep repeating forever and ever, which is when you guys are attaching metrics to various strategies and to particularly the costs, the thing I want to make sure that you're going to do is also talk about, or assign some numbers to, what if we don't do this now? What are the repercussions? Cost, like if we don't do it like in the next 4 years, but we do it in 15 years, what are the sort of carbon implications and what are the costs, literally the upfront cost implications, because everything only ever gets more expensive. So I don't know if that's actually literally opportunity cost, but that's what I want you guys to do if you can. And quickly in that slide that showed, or mentioned as one of the bullet points, healthcare or health benefits rather. I'm assuming that you'll also capture, if we do these great things, there will be reduction in healthcare expenditures because of the improvements in health. So I don't know how you capture that. If that's possible, great. And then the last thing, help me out here because I cannot remember if I haven't looked at the strategies in a while. I can't remember if there's any strategy that basically says, we're not just going to talk about electrification for future construction or significant rehabs. We're also going to talk somehow, somewhere about how we retrofit buildings, not just at the town or the school district, but broadly in the community. So help, because I don't remember. Thanks.
I'll pass that on to John or Charles.
I can take the second question on the healthcare. So EPA has, just based on lots of longitudinal data and data over time, so both geography based on your population, because the denser you are, the more an additional ton of particulate matter is going to impact people because more people are breathing it. So they have metrics, which essentially associate both the healthcare costs, and then in the unfortunate case that there's a life lost based on cancer rates, also the value of a statistical life. So that data is something that we would incorporate based on each reduced particulate matter ton, each reduced nitrous oxide ton, and reduced sulfur dioxide ton. So that will get incorporated when we have measures of that.
And to your question about existing buildings, yes, there is a strategy that is focused on existing buildings. Some of the slides that I presented just previous to now is, just examples. We didn't have the time to go through every strategy, and again, those were developed and discussed through the blueprint document development. But there is one specific to existing buildings, not only improving energy efficiency in existing buildings, but also helping to electrify some of those existing buildings. So we've kind of got one that's focused on the existing building stock, at least as it existed at the time of the either today or the previous inventory in 2017. And then we've got one that's focused on buildings that will be built in the future and making sure that future construction is efficient and electrified as much as possible.
Yes, and the one you're referring to is BH6 Deborah, to explore pursuing an aggregated triple electrification model in Acton to decarbonize buildings while improving energy efficiency and adding on-site renewable. So triple electrification means electrification of heating and cooling equipment, optimal energy efficiency, and then adding on-site renewables. So those are the 3 E's. And I think that kind of refers to the comment made by Jim, who said, reminder on the econ approach for housing upgrades, solar reduces the cost of electricity and thus reduces the operating cost of heat pumps. And then Richard said on the chat, going back to the chat now, and then we'll go back to raised hands. It says, you haven't mentioned how you plan to address the largest greenhouse gas contributor, which is transportation. To give an example with which I am personally familiar is that it is difficult to set up charging for EVs in condos and apartments. That's a really timely one to bring up because we will have that one in the discussion. What you saw previously was really just a sampling of like just to show you how the process is being conducted. And in the service of time, we wouldn't be able to go through all 20 strategies. That might be an 8-hour workshop. So instead, we're giving you like a snapshot of what that process looks like. And so we pulled the buildings as an example, but we'll actually be diving into the electric vehicles question in the discussion portion. And so the next question, Mary, actually, you have your hand raised, and I think we'll take 3 more. So Mary, Alyssa, and then Rob has a question on the chat, and I think then we can jump to the next section. Oh, Mary, you're muted. Still muted. I'll ask you to.
Hey, this is I'm sorry. I don't know why it wouldn't unmute, but anyway, thank you. My question is, when you're doing this analysis, what types of research do you do? Do you talk to architects? Do you talk to builders? And I saw an article the other day about resilient housing, which was certainly energy efficient. And it was really quite wonderful. The things they do. I'm wondering if you're consulting these types of resources.
I'll say that we have we have a larger team of people that will be involved in this project as we dive into these details, more so than the three of us from ERG that are here today. We have a whole facilities team that focuses on building related energy efficiency and energy use in buildings. A lot of certified energy managers and lead AP professionals that can weigh in and are up to date on some of these standards and assumptions that can be made at a municipal level. Since we're not really looking building by building, we are going to have to make some fairly gross assumptions for the overall building stock in Acton. But you know, some of it will depend on the not only what can be achieved, but what can be, how much change can actually occur. So there's the kind of the technical feasibility of making energy efficient upgrades in buildings, but there's also what we might assume some of this advocacy and incentivization that the town can provide would actually, that the change that can be affected by those strategies moving forward too. So there's kind of a dual dynamic going on there. But
Thank you. I also have one comment about Kim's question. I think that we're really going to need to do something big in terms of getting out to the public. 358 responses was very good, but we do have 27,000 residents in the town, so, or thereabouts. So I think we're really going to have to work at how we're going to communicate this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Alyssa?
Thanks, Andrea. My question is about the 4% emissions from gas leaks. And I'm wondering if that data identified whether those were biogenic or thermogenic in nature, because I've been reading that because sewer pipes and gas pipes are generally side by side underground, that unless you use the tech that can sort out the difference between the two, it's hard to assume which pipe they're coming from.
I can take that.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead, John.
So we're using the 2017 inventory that was developed prior to our involvement with the project. But I know from previous use of the tool that was employed to develop the inventory, that is based on it's basically just a factor, a percent factor based on total natural gas use by the town. So it's kind of an overarching assumption that a certain percentage of the natural gas that's used in the town is escaping due to leakage, whether it be in transmission or at the end point, you know, from leaky stoves or something like that. But it's a fairly gross assumption. That's, since it's based on natural gas usage, to answer your question, I think it is focused on natural gas and not sewer gas leakage. But it's not really looking at town specific infrastructure. It's just kind of an overarching percentage of total natural gas use.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, thank you so much, John. It is based on natural gas leaks. And then I'm gonna go ahead and paste the data on the greenhouse gas emissions that you can find in this document right here. There you'll see also the breakdown from wastewater as well. So you can, if you want to really dive into the numbers, you can find it in there. And I'd be happy to also help answer any specifics on the data if more questions come up over email as well.
There was one final question in the chat I just wanted to call out, and maybe ERG in the next portion of your presentation, I think you'll be getting to this part of your analysis. But I think earlier on, Kim had asked in the building analysis how you would envision incentivizing smaller houses in addition to fully electrified houses. And then again, that relates to Jim's point about also what about how solar interplays with heat pumps, and will that be part of the benefit analysis and some of the incentives type of analysis you might be doing later? So maybe we could just put that out there, and if it makes sense to address it in the part 2 of your presentation, if you could.
Okay. Yeah, why don't we keep going, and I'll see if I can address that on some of the forthcoming slides here. Okay, so now that we've got our strategies kind of grouped together, or actions grouped together into strategies, the way we're going to go forward with the greenhouse gas reduction potential is to make assumptions about the effectiveness. And as I mentioned in response to one of the previous questions, it's going to be a combination of technical feasibility and also the effectiveness of the actions that can be taken by the town, and what we kind of assume that residents will be able to implement using those incentives or advocacy or the tools that are put out there. As someone mentioned, there's 24,000 people in the town, but there were 360 responses, and there's about 30 of us here today. So, a lot of it is dependent on town participation and engagement and moving forward. And getting the message out there is important. There's only so much that the town government can actually do. I don't think things like mandating stopping the sale of natural gas appliances is a possibility. So it's going to be advocating for that change, incentivizing, providing incentives to some degree, but then ultimately it's up to town residents and businesses within the town. So there have to be some assumptions about the effectiveness of these strategies, taking that into account too. We'll look at the implementation timeframe as well when we think some of these things can actually start happening and having some impact. And all of this is going to be relative to a forecast of future emissions. So we have the latest 2017 inventory, but the goal is for net zero by 2030, and your emissions in 2030 are not going to be the same as they were in 2017. So we have to kind of project out to 2030 based on some of those demographic forecasts that I mentioned, to see what emissions might look like 8 years from now. So you can go to the next slide. And this is, there we go. So this is an example from another community that I worked with recently. What you see here is the forecast. You see the history through 2020 and then the forecast out through 2050. The different colors represent different sectors of emissions, whether it be transportation or residential energy or commercial energy, wastewater, all those various things, same basic sectors, categories of emissions that you have in your inventory, and how they project out. I think this one was based solely on population growth forecast. But if there are other forecasts available, I mentioned housing units or employment, then some of those growth scenarios can be applied to specific categories of emissions independently from one another. So the dotted line here is their goal, or where it's the straight line reduction to their goal, which for this community was an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. So you can see how drastic that goal is compared to the forecast of future emissions. Now, this was a community in the South where growth was pretty high. I think almost 100% growth over, between 2007 and 2050. So a lot of growth, and a lot of growth in corresponding in the greenhouse gas emissions forecast. But this really provides the basis by which we will analyze the effectiveness of all of these strategies from a greenhouse gas reduction potential over time. You can go to the next slide, please. So once we've done our analysis and we have this forecast in place, we will generate a graphic like this, and this will all be supported by data and tabular data, but this is kind of a graphical output for you to look at of how these different strategies will layer in and work towards meeting your goal by 2030. In this case, it was 2050. So you can see that that same top dark line is the forecast from the previous slide. The dotted line is the same goal, straight line reduction to 80% reduction by 2050. And then all the different colored wedges in there are various strategies. And you can see some start immediately, some start in 2030, various levels of effectiveness. But all of this is kind of the graphical output of the analysis that we'll be working on over the next month or two. And with that, I will turn it over to Charles to talk a little bit more about the benefit cost analysis.
Great, thanks, John. And we've certainly got at some of this with the questions that have come up, but just to recap, with our benefit cost analysis for each strategy, or sometimes with actions within a strategy, we'll be looking at what's our assumed baseline, what's going to happen without the strategy or without the action. And then we will want to look at lifetime and life cycle costs and benefits. So it's not just the purchase of an EV, but it's how many years you have it, what are your maintenance and operation costs compared to a conventional vehicle. We want to look at the financial costs and financial benefits. That's money actually changing hands. And then we also want to look at the air quality and greenhouse gas benefits. So the air quality being what I referred to earlier as particulate matter, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, and the health impact. And then the greenhouse gas benefits being what I referred to earlier as the reduction in flooding, heat impacts, those that are connected to climate change. And then what we'll be doing is trying to put these in terms of actionable metrics, often dollars per reduction in CO2. That's what they call a cost effectiveness metric, and the net benefit. And that's where you can incorporate those non-market costs like impacts from health or reduced impacts to health and reduced climate change impacts. So again, we'll have the financial and our non-market included. And the other thing I'll say is that the purpose of this, when you do these type of analyses on quite a number of strategies and actions, these are not going to be academic deep dives where every single component of every single strategy is looked at from a quantitative perspective. We want to capture this qualitatively, but we really want to, our goal is to sort of say, here are some strategies that are actually going to be money saving. Here are some ones that are going to be reasonable. Here's approximately the cost it's going to be, whether it's $74 per metric ton or 83, and we captured sort of this smaller assumptions, not going to necessarily change any actions or recommendations associated with it. It's also really important to capture some of the very high cost, maybe less cost effective strategies, because those in particular might be ones that are going to be hard to implement or might need more incentives. So again, it's not necessarily about total precision, but it's about getting the whole picture, incorporating some of the qualitative, and then putting some perspective on these. Again, given the time we're working with, the number of strategies, I just want to sort of set that expectation of what we can do. There's been a lot of great questions that deal with some of the nuances, and we want to capture those. We want to hear about those. We want to make sure that that's part of the story. But again, that's sort of when you're doing this type of analysis, some of the expectations that I just wanted to set as well. And next slide, please. So these are examples of what we would call cost effectiveness. One was for the state of Maine, one was for the city of Alameda, California. So like electrifying the city's fleet in Alameda, California was about $23 per metric ton of CO2 reduced. Electrification of new residential construction was about $800 per metric ton of CO2 reduced in that particular situation. And then for Maine, we developed quite a few kind of ranking the cost effectiveness, where a lot of the electrification strategies were cost savings or very low and cost effective, like electric vehicle consumption. And a lot of the taxes and then restoration of marsh and eelgrass for reducing CO2 alone, those were some of the less cost effective. But again, there's other benefits to some of these that sort of need to be captured as well. So that's one type of metric that you would typically see. In addition to the benefits are about X when you include financial, health benefits, and reductions in climate change impacts. And the costs are about Y, both capital and operation and maintenance. Next slide.
So I can jump in here. Thank you so much, Charles. So again, this is a section for clarifying questions on the methodology for analysis, and then we're going to jump into a little exercise. And I am mindful of the time. It's 12:50. We don't have a ton of time for the discussion portion, so maybe let's see how many questions we get for clarification and play it by ear. So it looks like actually we only have one question from Deborah, and then the rest are comments, which I encourage you all to read. So Deborah said, wondering what factors go into analysis of feasibility, upfront and operations, and opportunity costs. What entity has authority to deploy, enact technical feasibility, barriers, local political will, funding sources, other. And she's wondering whether air quality here represents health benefits. Charles, do you want to hop onto this one?
So yes, air quality, it would represent health benefits. That's correct. Particulate matter, nitrous oxides, sulfur dioxide reduction. So tailpipe emissions are an example there. The first part. Feasibility can certainly include upfront costs. That's one component without a doubt. But there could be other barriers. EV charging stations might be really hard to put in multi-dwelling areas, I guess.
If I could just jump in, I'm really wondering what are the factors that you include when you analyze what feasibility means? That's really what I'm asking.
Are you talking from a technical standpoint or from a cost standpoint?
I'm talking about all of the above. When you use the term feasibility and you're going to evaluate that, I'm wondering what's the list of factors that go into your consideration?
Well, I think it varies from strategy to strategy, obviously. On the building side, there's certain, and again, we're talking about a whole city worth of buildings. We're not talking about a specific building that we can go into and do an audit of. So there's certain generalizations that we'll have to make, but we'll look at research to see what can be technically achievable based on the current energy use per square foot and what that might come down to for residential buildings or commercial buildings. Other strategies might be even more straightforward. The net zero by 2030 is an aggressive goal. So to have a strategy that says 100% carbon-free electricity by 2030, it's aggressive, but it kind of needs to happen. So we may just assume that that's going to happen and that it needs to happen by certain mechanisms, certain actions that were laid out in the blueprint. So in that case, the question of feasibility is kind of assumed that it will be achievable and that it needs to happen in order to meet the goal. So there's a bit of a balance there between what is, we don't want to be overly optimistic, but we want to be optimistic enough to meet the goal at the same time. So That probably doesn't answer your question, but it'll be a strategy by strategy analysis.
Thank you, John. And then scrolling all the way back, there was also a question by Rob. So Rob said, greenhouse gas emissions from goods and foods, scope 3, haven't appeared prominently in your strategies. Is there a way to include progress on reducing these impacts? In the stated reduction goals, pie chart does not include these. So actions to reduce emissions in goods and services, while were not mentioned here, they are addressed in the blueprint, but mostly under the strategies of outreach, education and outreach through things like Energize Acton, which is a work that the Acton Climate Coalition and the town of Acton are leading together. And it includes actions specifically that address those kind of scope 3 emissions. However, there are data limitations. So the greenhouse gas inventory does mostly focus on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So there are actions to address those emissions. However, they are not being tracked. So that's sort of like the limits of just based on what we are able to track. And then let's see. Jim Snyder Grant mentioned expensive actions that are also big greenhouse gas emissions reducers are also good targets for advocating for state and federal government support. I think that's a really good point. Alyssa said, please monetize. In addition to air quality, other natural services, flood resistance, air cooling, carbon sequestration, etc. For example, zoning policies that protect open space result in high return on investment when money spent on all related. Sorry, I think for one tiny example, hiking gear all included, smiley face. It's hard to describe all the different emojis sometimes. So I think we should jump to discussion soon because we addressed some of this, but Madeline did make a comment. I wouldn't have known about the meeting last night if I wasn't part of the climate and housing organization. There seems to be a lack of communication to multifamily building where renters live, especially low income. So you can't make those assumptions. 300 people out of 27,000 is between 1% and 2% of the people in town. And I think that kind of goes back to this whole question of, outreach, there's sort of always room for improvement. So if folks have any other suggestions for how to, expand the outreach, I think that would be, greatly appreciated. And then we also do encourage you to sign up for the updates as well. And appreciate your comment, Madeline. Let's jump to the EV question. So we can do an exercise.
Ben, do you mind sharing slide 24? Oh, perfect. Great. So we had a few discussion questions we wanted to offer for the last 15 to 20 minutes of our time together. And these are to kind of do deeper dives into the strategies, which is discussed before, are kind of a grouping of the different actions from the blueprint. So the first one we wanted to ask the group about was strategy 10, which is to increase the adoption of electric vehicles. And that is a conglomeration of three actions in the blueprint. One was promoting EV adoption. Another one was creating an incentive program to help provide access to EVs for low-income residents. And then the final one was implementing an income-tiered electric vehicle car sharing program in partnership with community organizations and affordable housing developments. And so we had a few discussion questions that are on the slide, and I think we'll put them in the chat so we can all see each other instead during this discussion. But we'd invite people to ask us to inform the analysis by answering what, if anything, is stopping you from getting an EV right now, or stopping your neighbors if you happen to know what the town could do to incentivize this action, who you think will benefit from this action, and how we can ensure people benefit equitably. And you may hear a toddler screaming in the background, so I'm going to go on mute for the moment. I apologize.
And actually, Julie, since we don't have the questions up anymore, do you mind pasting? Oh, you already on it. Thank you. So the first question is, What, if anything, is stopping you from getting an electric vehicle now? Alyssa.
So for me, it was availability. We went to look for one and there was an 8-month wait. So we ended up getting an electric hybrid at a used car dealership.
Great, thank you. I don't know that we can start a production company like EV manufactured by the town of Acton, but very helpful to learn about those barriers for sure. Mary?
I bought a car in 2019 and the things that kept me back was I used to travel some long distances. And also there was a considerable increase in the cost of the car. But your next question helps that.
Yeah, so the next question is, what could the town do to incentivize this action? So feel free to build on that. Actually, Mary, if you'd like to now.
Oh, I just think the incentives are good. Like this is not an EV, but I got a call the other day from Sunrun and they sent me something telling me there were thousands of dollars now for solar. So I called them and they're going to come. I don't know if thousands of dollars are, but I just think any kind of incentive, although I think the incentive does not have to be as great right now. I think people are seeing the value of EV cars. But I think there's a shortage of cars because of the shortage of the computer equipment, the digital stuff.
Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. And then I do see Richard, you're raising your hand. And just so you know, I don't see everyone. So if you are waving your hand and I'm not calling on you and you don't find the raise hand feature, feel free to just either unmute yourself or use the chat. All right, go ahead, Richard.
I live in Audubon Hill, which is a condo in South Acton, and we're having trouble determining what the right technology is for charging stations. And we have our own issues with trying to get electric power to the places that we have separate garages, and we're not apparently allowed to put a new meter in the garage for each occupant. In other words, they want us to have one meter, which is at our house. So now we have to dig trenches 100 feet or so to the garage to get power from the house to the garage when there's already power at the garage. So it's just been a nightmare. We had one person who has an electric vehicle, and all we could offer her was a charging station at the recreation building, which is like, a half-mile walk for her to her house. And I'm sure there are issues of their own in the condominium, in apartment buildings. But in the condos, it's the fact that we are not a separate standalone house.
Yeah. And so when you say that you need an individual meter, that they require one, is that the condo association you're referring to?
No, the electric company won't let us put another meter in the garage because they want us to have our own meter at the house, which we have. But that's not whether we need the power. So they're saying you got one meter and you got to figure out how to get the power to your garage, which is a 100-foot trench.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Condos and the shared spaces in general, shared private spaces, they do share a lot of these common barriers in installing chargers. I didn't realize it was coming from the electric company directly though. So that's really helpful to hear. Judy?
Yes, just knowing where charging is available, like especially if you're traveling out of state. The idea of going hiking in New Hampshire and maybe needing to charge, where can that be done? It would be nice to have information about where charging is available.
Yeah.
Beyond just at home or the local local charging places, which is also good to know.
There is a website that when I attended a session like this on electric vehicles, and there's a website that you can, I know I could put it in the chat, I suppose. I'll try to find it.
Yeah, there are several apps that can tell you where all the chargers are. But range anxiety, that's what they call it, is a real thing. So I think it's a big fear of, running out of charge and not finding a charger nearby. But those apps can certainly help in planning trips. And the video Richard mentioned is an EV 101 event that Energize Acton led, and we will include a link. I think in the follow-up email, we'll include a link and resources to any questions that pop up. But it's still a really great point, because infrastructure is a barrier, right? Lack of the EV infrastructure, EV charging infrastructure. Sorry, I lost the list of questions because of the comments. Okay, so Deborah and Jude, and then I think we can jump to the other set of questions. Deborah?
Thank you. Quickly, in case anybody doesn't know about Drive Green, it's a Green Energy Consumers Alliance program. If you're thinking about EVs, go check it out. And following on that, one of the things I'm thinking about, two things in terms of the cost issues, because they're not inexpensive. EVs are not inexpensive. And when I think about, sort of equity issues, two things come to mind. One is we could be urging the Drive Green program, for instance, to address this issue in some way. If they can figure out some kind of programmatic way to go at this. Another thing is, just like I always want people to develop tool co-ops, because not every single human needs to own a snowblower, for instance, or a Sawzall, whatever. But I wonder in terms of EV sharing programs, what role the town could take in trying to set that up. So, not everybody uses a car all the time. I mean, for folks who do, it's a different issue. But if you're jumping in the car every other day to run errands, maybe there's a way to make this work for people who don't necessarily want or can afford to own one. So that's just that. Thanks.
Yes.
That's great. Thank you, Deborah. Those are really great suggestions. And we're jotting down all these suggestions just so you all know. And Deborah started touching on the third and fourth question. But I'll jump to Jude first, and then we can jump into those. Jude?
Yeah, two sort of comments really. One is that there's really a divide between people who own EVs and those who don't. It's just this huge chasm, because as soon as you get in there and talk to people and own one, then you learn about all the apps, and there's plenty of resources out there, but until you're crossed it. So how to get some hybridization between those two, it would be helpful. And then the other comment was that when I bought my electric car, I decided I'm just going to rent or borrow a car if I do a long distance trip. And so that sort of, when Deborah's saying, some way of car sharing or getting, I think that is very realistic. As a need, it's a really realistic need. We don't need to have access. Yeah, that's all.
Great. Thank you, Jude. Those are great follow-up suggestions as well. So the next is of that question is, so who will benefit from the action to expand EVs and EV infrastructure options? And how can we ensure people equitably benefit from the strategy? And actually, it might be helpful, Van, can you repaste the strategy so folks see it at the bottom? Thank you. And we'll be closing out soon. So if you could, I see a few more hands raised. So the strategies increase adoption of electric vehicles, promote EV adoption, create an incentive program to help provide increased access to EVs for low-income residents in Acton, implement an income-tiered EV car sharing program in partnership with community organizations and affordable housing developments. And then again, the question is, who will who will benefit from this action. And then how can we ensure that these actions are implemented in an equitable manner? David.
Hi, I think that the biggest thing to make sure that the EV adoption can be equitable that we can do is to make sure that there is charging infrastructure, home charging infrastructure for renters. That's essential really for owning an EV. And if you take a long trip, you need a fast charger along the way. But when you're around town, you don't need to charge around town if you have a home charger. So that's the biggest thing. And so somehow facilitating that and answering the questions like the question that Richard brought up, the electric company certainly has the ability to have 2 meters on one account, and why they can't for his situation, that I don't understand that, right? So we should try to figure that out.
Yeah. Thank you, David. And to your point, Madeline mentioned looking at how, so she basically mentioned that the lack of opportunity to charge a vehicle if she were to buy one. So going back to your comment of just improving the EV charging infrastructure. And so we have so many comments. I feel like we haven't been able to read them all out loud. So we are past time. I guess, well, we can leave the line open. I mean, you are free to, sign off. I just want to really quickly recap on next steps, and then we can come back to any additional comments or questions that people feel like they didn't get to address. So the next steps will be for ERG to gather data, conduct the greenhouse gas reduction analysis, benefit cost analysis, and begin developing recommendations. So we sort of started that process right now. We got a sense of what that's going to look like. So it's basically building on these actions. And then we will be sharing preliminary results at the community meeting at the end of April. So we'll be updating everyone who registered here on information on how to register to that meeting. Again, we'll also be including updates in our Climate Action Plan blog. And then I'm going to go ahead and include the registration for the newsletter here. I encourage you all to please register. You'll receive updates on all future meetings. And then you can also reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm going to go ahead and put my email here. With that, thank you all so much